Returning to the 1980s, the matchmaker introduced me to a prospective college student. I didn't agree because this prospective college student, in my past life, used the living expenses I gave him to fall in love at school. After graduating, he told me, "I'm a college student, and you're a migrant worker. Do you think you're a good match for me?" Indeed, we weren't a good match. So in this life, I rejected the matchmaker. But I didn't expect that he would come to me on his own. When Icarus came over, I was crouching in the kitchen, kindling a fire. The big yellow dog my family raised suddenly started barking wildly. I thought it was some naughty child from a neighbor's house. Afraid of scaring the child, I quickly dropped the firewood in my hand and ran out. To my surprise, as soon as I went out, I was stunned. The younger version of Icarus stood at the door, panting heavily and staring at me. "Why didn't you agree to get engaged to me?" My mother, who was coming out of the main hall with a dustpan at that moment, was also stunned. I was shocked, while my mother was delighted. After all, there was no such handsome young man in the surrounding villages. And he even came to our home with such sincerity. She affectionately pulled him into the main hall. And with deft hands, she poured a cup of hot tea for Icarus and even extravagantly added a spoonful of white sugar. The corners of my mouth twitched. And I didn't say anything. Icarus must have run all the way here. Even after sitting for a long time, he still hadn't caught his breath. It was the coldest time of winter. He was wearing a military green cotton padded jacket. A strand of hair on his forehead stood up from the wind. And there was sweat on his face. Even so, his handsome face couldn't help but evoke a favorable impression. In my past life, I was charmed by him just like this. I willingly gave him all the money I earned from working. During winter and summer vacations, I would bring him to my rental house and wait on him attentively, just to let him review his studies with peace of mind. Fortunately, hadn't fulfilledly. He was also diligent and became the first graduate student in the neighboring villages. I was so happy that I continued to support him. Icarus was admitted to a university in the distant south for his postgraduate studies. On the day I went to see him off, I stuffed all the 2,000 I had just saved into his hands and told him not to be too thrifty, lest he be laughed at by his classmates. Icarus held my hand movedly and said, "I will study hard and come back to marry you when I graduate." Hercules next door reminded me to be careful not to end up with nothing. I didn't believe it and confidently retorted him, "Icarus is a college student. Scholars value faith and righteousness and won't act like that." However, the facts proved that Hercules was right. Those promises that had been made before were already spoiled before they could be fulfilled. On the day Icarus graduated from his postgraduate studies, I took a whole night's strain to attend his graduation ceremony. But I only saw the scene of him embracing another girl. I couldn't believe it and rushed up to question him hysterically. But I only got his reply, "I'm a graduate student, and you're a migrant worker. Do you think you're a good match for me? If you have a sense of self-awareness, you should leave quietly instead of shouting here. The only one who will lose face is yourself." After saying that, Icarus held the girl's hand and left. I heard that they were going to attend a graduation party. That night, I waited at the school gate until 12 o'clock, but I didn't see Icarus come back. I was hungry and tired, so I took out 2 chicken feet from the bag I carried with me to fill my stomach. These chicken feet were brought from my hometown. Because Icarus liked them, I specially marinated them and carried them here. Before coming to the school, I even borrowed the pot from the owner of the roadside breakfast shop to heat them up. But now they were completely cold. I mechanically stuffed the chicken feet into my mouth, and before I knew it, tears streamed down my face. All the students passing by looked at me with a puzzled expression. I couldn't hold it in anymore and burst into tears, covering my face. I had waited for him for so many years. And in the end, I only got such a sentence. I wasn't willing to accept it. I went to his house and cried and made a scene. But in the end, he openly brought that girl back home, making me the laughingstock in everyone's eyes. Everyone said that I had been played by Icarus for 8 years and had become a used woman. In that era, such words could ruin a woman's life. My mother went to Icarus's family to seek justice. But unexpectedly, They closed the door and wouldn't open it. In a fit of anger, she crashed her head against the door of Icarus's family and died. This incident caused a sensation in the whole county. Under the pressure of public opinion, Icarus agreed to marry me. On the day of our wedding, when passing by my mother's graveyard, I sent the driver out of the car, stepped on the gas pedal, and sent both Icarus and myself off the cliff. When I opened my eyes again, I had returned to the age of 18. Ever since meeting my mother, Icarus had behaved very sensibly and appropriately. As soon as my mother poured the tea, he quickly stood up to take it and smiled, saying, "Thank you, Auntie." My mother, as if she had never been called Auntie before, smiled so widely that her teeth were showing. "What are you being polite for? Sit down. Sit down." She pulled Icarus to sit down and asked about his family and studies. When she heard that his grades were the best in the whole county, she was instantly overjoyed. She said several good in a row. "I will definitely work hard to get into university and won't let you down," he assured my mother seriously with a sincere look on his face. After saying that, he secretly glanced in my direction. Noticing Icarus's gaze, my mother was taken aback for a moment. And then she smiled knowingly. "Phoenix, you talk to him. Mom is going to buy some groceries." After saying that, she winked at me and went out happily with a basket. There were only the two of us left in the room. I stretched out my hand to Icarus. "Give it here." Icarus was taken aback. "What?" I gave him a cold smile, stood up, and snatched the cup from his hand, drinking it all in one go. My mother regarded that bit of sugar as a treasure. I had been reborn for several days, and she hadn't been willing to let me have a taste. Anyway, having fulfilled my obsession, I couldn't let Icarus have it for nothing. "Come on. Tell me what you're here for." Icarus seemed to have not expected me to have such an attitude. He was silent for a moment. "Aunt Chen said that you agreed to our marriage. I want to know why." Aunt Chen was the matchmaker who arranged our marriage. In my past life, when Icarus insisted on breaking off the engagement with me, Aunt Chen came to my house with a walking stick to apologize, blaming herself for misjudging people and ruining my life. It wasn't Aunt Chen who ruined my life, but this man who used my feelings. What else could it be? Of course, it's because we're not a good match. I looked up at him, my eyes full of obvious hostility. "I've already rejected it. But you still came here. What's the matter? Are you going to act like a rascal?" A trace of panic flashed in Icarus's eyes, and he quickly denied it. "I don't mean that. I just saw your photo and thought you were very lovely, so I wanted to give it another try. Then I remembered that in my past life, it was precisely because of my face that Icarus got engaged to me. Although I wasn't good at studying, even my mother would occasionally sigh, having fulfilled my sigh. It's strange. How could I have given birth to such a beautiful daughter?" After we got engaged in my past life, Icarus's mother also once said, "Icarus has very high standards. He rejected many girls introduced to him, but as soon as he saw your photo, he was smitten. At first, Icarus liked my face. Later, he liked my meticulous stare for him. And later, he became fond of power and money. I became an old and valueless vase that could be discarded at will. But now there are many people who like me. You're just a poor student. What right do you have to fight for me?" I looked up at him and sneered. "Is it because you have a thick skin?" "Based on my grades," Icarus said confidently, "I can get into university. And maybe I can even pursue higher studies. Isn't that enough qualification?" I sneered. "I'm afraid that by then, you'll think I'm not qualified. Do you think you're not worthy of me and are afraid that I won't want you after I graduate?" Icarus suddenly gained confidence and raised his voice. "If you're not reassured, we can get married first." The marriage he mentioned was just holding a wedding banquet. This was very common in rural areas at that time. If the couple was underage, they wouldn't get the marriage certificate first. They would just invite relatives and neighbors to a meal, and that would be considered a marriage. But in my past life, what was the difference between us and being married? In the end, he still discarded me. This time, if I have anything to do with him again, I'll deserve what happened to me in my past life. I took a step back and looked at him up and down with a look of disgust. Who gave you the nerve to be so confident? To put it bluntly, I just looked down on you. If you had any sense, you should leave quietly. Shouting here. You might not feel ashamed, but I do. When he said these words to me in my past life, I couldn't refute him. Now, throwing these words back at him is really satisfying. Icarus always cared about his face. When he heard such words, his face immediately changed. But he managed to suppress his anger and smiled calmly. Phoenix, hading fulfilled my psi. Don't be willful. If I'm not mistaken, I should be your best choice. Right? I looked towards the next door yard and smiled. That's not necessarily true. Icarus didn't notice my gaze. He was stunned for a moment and then smiled knowingly. You don't mean those illiterates who didn't even finish high school, do you? What's the difference between those people and idiots? His tone was very disdainful. His grades and education had always been his proud capital. He never took seriously anyone who was inferior to him in these aspects. I sneered. He is indeed a fool. But you're a complete asshole. This sentence was too insulting. Icarus was angry and furious. He suddenly stood up. Fine. Just be stubborn. You'll regret it someday. I don't know if I'll regret it or not. And he will definitely regret coming to my house. When he left in the end, his face was a mix of red and green. It was wonderful. In my past life, after Icarus broke off the engagement, there was actually a fool who wanted to marry me. At that time, my mother had just died, and my father was also bedridden. Everyone avoided my family as if there was something dirty in our house, and they were afraid that they would have bad luck if they got involved. In the end, it was Hercules who helped take care of my mother's funeral arrangements. Hercules was named Hercules and lived next door to my house. Our two houses were separated by a wall. He didn't do well in his studies. After graduating from junior high school, he went to work in the South, and later, he went into business. I heard that he had made a lot of money. Because of this, there were a continuous stream of people introducing girls to him every year. But for some reason, he rejected them all. The day before I married Icarus, he leaned on the wall and asked me, "Do you want to consider marrying me? Although I'm not as learned as him, I'm richer than him. And I'm better looking than him too." His tone was proud and cocky, as if he was just joking, but in fact, his slightly nervous expression had already betrayed him. I looked at him quietly for a long time and smiled. I'm afraid it's not possible in this life. If there is a next life, I will definitely marry you. TSK. You wish. I might not even want to marry you in the next life. At that time, neither of us expected that people could really have a next life. After being reborn, when I saw Hercules again, he was holding a hoe and turning over the vegetable plot in front of the door. I rested my chin in my hand and stared at him intently. He didn't know where to put his hands under my gaze. Finally, heading fulfilled, he asked me angrily, "If you have something to say, just say it. Why are you staring at me?" I didn't expect him to have such a personality when he was young. Thinking of playing a joke on him, I pointed at a large pile of wooden stakes at the door and said, "My dad has gone to work in the county. You know, I can't chop wood." I thought he would tell me to dream on. But to my surprise, he agreed without hesitation. He pulled that pile of firewood into his own yard that day and said he would bring it over to me after chopping it. At this moment, I suddenly wanted to see what Hercules was doing. As soon as I thought of it, I did it. I found a stool and placed it against the wall, then stepped on the stool and looked towards the opposite side, and I was stunned at the first glance. It was the middle of winter. Hercules was wearing cotton trousers on his lower body, and was bare-chested on his upper body. He was chopping wood in the yard. He seemed to have a grudge against the firewood. With one swing of the axe, a wooden stake thicker than my waist was instantly split into two halves. My eyelids twitched, and I called out, "Hercules!" Hercules looked in my direction upon hearing my voice. His pupils dilated in shock immediately, and he pointed at me trembling. "What are you doing lying on the wall?" I raised my face and smiled at him, replying, "Looking at you." The axe in Hercules' hand dropped directly. He picked up his shirt in a flurry and wrapped it around his body. His face turned red instantly. And he was both shy and angry. Do you know what shame is? Which girl is like you? Looking at his red ears. I was also stunned. He was so innocent that I felt a bit embarrassed too. I had to awkwardly shift my gaze. Then I'll go down. Wait a minute. Hercules walked over awkwardly. Tilted his head back. And his gaze landed on my face. That. How did your blind date go? Oh, I rejected him. What? Hercules widened his eyes and looked at me suspiciously. I heard that he's a prospective college student. Isn't that good enough? He's quite good. But I don't like him. Then. What kind of person do you like? I was standing quite high up. When I looked down at him, my gaze just landed on his open collar. The image of him just now flashed through my mind instantly. So I replied with a mischievous intent, I like someone with a good figure and abdominal muscles. I thought I would see Hercules furious. But to my surprise, he was stunned for a moment. Instead, he looked at me steadily and asked, Really? I looked at him, and my face felt inexplicably hot. Yeah, really. Hercules immediately grinned and giggled. After thinking about it, I added, it would be even better if he can chop wood. This time, he laughed even more foolishly. I was showing off while lying on the wall, when suddenly my mother's angry roar came from behind me. Phoenix! Get down here right now. My mother was extremely angry. When she came back, she met Icarus and learned that it was me who drove him away. She insisted that I compensate her for her prospective college student son-in-law. A college student son-in-law is out of the question. But a college student daughter is still possible. In my previous life, in order to have something to talk about with Icarus, I self-studied a lot of high school knowledge. After being reborn, I had already decided to take the college entrance examination by myself. Because I finally understood that saying, it's better to earn 10 cows and tiles of gold by myself and to help him achieve his lofty aspirations. No one can shield me from the wind and rain forever. Unless I have an umbrella in my own hand. My mother was shocked by this news and stopped nagging about her son-in-law. She stared at me warily. No way. The money at home is reserved for your younger brother to go to college. The family can't afford to support two people. I had already mentally prepared myself for her attitude. My mother had the common problem of rural women in this era. She favored sons over daughters and believed that it was a waste of money for girls to study. Thinking of the things she did for me in my previous life, and decided not to argue with her. Mom, my younger brother is still young. Can you lend me that money for now? No way. Don't even think about it. My mother was very firm about this matter and refused to agree no matter what. We were in a deadlock. Suddenly, a head poked out from the wall and shouted, I'll support her. We both turned our heads. Hercules touched his head embarrassedly. Can I support her? 2 minutes later, Hercules came to my house neatly dressed. As soon as he entered the door, he took out a cloth bag from his bosom and stuffed it into my mother's hands without saying a word. Then he scratched his head sheepishly. This is the money I've saved over the past few years. Please take it and use it for Phoenix's studies. My mother held the bag of money. And her face turned red with embarrassment. Phoenix is just being crazy. Ignore her. You need to keep this money for getting married. Take it back quickly. It's okay. This money was originally meant for her. Look at you. Kid. How can you give this money to her? She suddenly paused. Her eyes widening in horror. You too? Hercules smiled and glanced at me shyly. My mother took a sharp breath. And with a swish, she stuffed the bag back into Hercules' hands and pushed him outside. We can afford to support our daughter ourselves. We don't need your money. Go quickly. Go quickly. Before anyone could react, she directly pushed him out the door in one breath and slammed the door shut. Mom, how can you do this? Hercules is a nice guy. My mother pointed at my nose and glared at me. Don't you dare speak for him. I immediately shut up. This matter scared my mother so much that she locked me in the room and guarded me closely, for fear that I would meet Hercules. I was afraid that she would get too angry and harm herself. So I obediently read books in the room and didn't even dare to mention Hercules' name. When my father came back in the evening, the two of them discussed for a long time. Finally, having to fail violently, they gritted their teeth and agreed to let me study. At worst, we'll sell the land. Anyway, heading to sell lied say. You can't have any contact with Hercules. I understood why they opposed it so much. Hercules was 2 years older than me. His parents passed away when he was 12. Since then, he has been making a living by reselling small commodities in the town. That is what people call a middleman. An orphan without parents, coupled with an unreliable occupation. So even though he was already 20 years old, there wasn't even anyone to arrange a blind date for him. No parents would want to marry their daughter to him. Neither did my mother. I couldn't very well tell her that Hercules would be very successful in the future, and that it was him who took care of her until the end of her life in my previous life. If I said that, my mother would definitely beat me to death. Although I didn't plan to use Hercules' money, it was absolutely impossible for me to draw a clear line with him. Seeing that I didn't speak, my mother pinched me angrily. Did you hear me? Say something. Do you want to piss me off to death? Seeing that she was about to cry, I quickly nodded. I heard you. I heard you. This matter couldn't be rushed. Anyway, cutting to sell my obsession. In my previous life, he didn't get married even when I died. So there was no need to be in a hurry at this moment. Although I promised not to meet Hercules again, my parents still didn't feel at ease. They contacted someone to sell the land that day, took me to a school in the county, and after I passed the entrance examination, they paid for my accommodation. Before I knew it, I was already sitting in the classroom. I was extremely happy to be able to return to school. Of course, it would be even better if that annoying scumbag wasn't there. When I entered the classroom, I saw Icarus sitting below at a glance. He looked at me as if he had seen a ghost, his eyes wide open. After 2 classes, my deskmate whispered to me, "Phoenix, it seems that the top student in our grade has been looking at you all the time." Icarus was sitting in the front. In just one class, he casually turned his head to look at me more than 10 times. Finally, heading to fell wide sigh. Even the teacher couldn't stand it anymore and called his name in public. Only then did he restrain himself a bit. I was too lazy to pay attention to him. I had to avenge the grudges from my previous life. But my life in this life was even more important. What I needed to do now was to study hard and get into a good university. During the break, Icarus pulled me into a corner when no one was paying attention and gritted his teeth, saying, "What are say? What are you doing here?" I remembered that when I first went to his school in my previous life, he also said this to me with shock and disgust. At that time, I was afraid that he would be angry. So I tried my best to hide my body in the corner, for fear of being seen and embarrassing him. But now I sneered, pushed him away, and walked a few steps to a place where there were a lot of people. Then I raised my voice towards Icarus. "Are you blind? Can't you see that I'm here to study?" When the classmates heard the commotion, they all looked over. Icarus' face turned red instantly, and he shouted in a low voice, "Stop embarrassing yourself here. What's a woman like you doing at school? School isn't a place for you. Go home right now." He actually ordered me in such a tone, which made me laugh out of anger. "Which pond did you crawl out of, you arrogant turtle? Whether I go to school or not has nothing to do with you. What? Is the school owned by your family? You can come but I can't?" As soon as I shouted these words, the corridor fell silent for a moment, and all the classmates around us looked towards us. Icarus was so anxious that he grabbed my arm. "Shut up, I'll give you one last chance. Leave the school right now, and maybe I'll still be willing to marry you." I directly pushed him away and cursed. "Marry your mother? Can't you understand human language? You've been rejected twice and you're still pestering me. What? Are you that eager to live off a woman?" At this moment, someone behind us shouted, "The principal is coming." The classmates panicked and scattered, running towards the classroom. Icarus was afraid that his face would be clearly seen, so he also lowered his head and ran. Unexpectedly, heading fulfilled my obsession. Just after running a couple of steps, he bumped right into the principal's arms. The old principal with white hair was knocked down to the ground by him. His glasses and books fell all over the place. Icarus quickly went to help him up, but he didn't see the glasses on the ground. With a snap, he stepped on the principal's glasses and broke them. The old principal was so angry that he slapped his thigh. "You've gone too far. I think you're all out of control." Half an hour later, in front of all the teachers and students in the school, I passionately recounted the entire process of the incident. Icarus stood beside me like a quail, with his head lowered and not saying a word. He looked as if he wished he could find a crack in the ground to crawl into. This was probably the first time he had been so humiliated. Under the gaze of everyone, his face slowly turned from red to green, and finally became completely pale. Although the school only gave him a verbal reprimand. For Icarus, being humiliated in public was even more unbearable than having his life taken away. The classmates' filter for the top student in the grade was shattered. They gathered in groups and pointed at him. After this incident, Icarus seemed to have changed into a different person. He kept his head down no matter what class it was. He avoided people when he saw them. As long as someone spoke in a low voice, he thought they were talking about him. Last time, he even flipped over a classmate's desk. The parent of that classmate came to the school and, in a fit of anger, slapped Icarus across the face. Icarus completely lost his temper this time and rushed up to fight with that person. This incident was so serious that the school asked Icarus to invite his parents. Icarus's mother had always been proud of her son since he was a child. Losing face this time, she slapped him across the face in public as soon as she arrived. Taking 2 slaps in a row completely shattered Icarus's self-esteem. He became even more withdrawn and his grades plummeted. A classmate secretly said that he was a psycho and were all afraid to associate with him. On the last day before the winter vacation, when school was over, my desk mate quietly reminded me, "Phoenix, have you noticed that Icarus has been looking at you with a really terrifying gaze recently? You must be careful when you go home." After the classes in the morning today, the vacation would start. The students who lived on campus all had to go home, and her worry was not unfounded. I touched the brick in my bag and told her not to worry. After school, Icarus indeed followed me into an alley. Seeing that there was no one around, he dropped his school bag, let out a couple of nervous laughs, and looked at me with a cold and sinister gaze. "It's all your fault. You bitch. You've gotten me into this mess." I reached into my school bag and sneered. "You brought this upon yourself. You deserve it. Bitch. Since you don't appreciate my kindness, and I'll make you taste it." Aha! Before Icarus could finish, he was suddenly kicked from behind, and his whole body fell forward, with his mouth hitting the stone slab heavily. Hercules, his face full of anger, stepped forward, grabbed his hair, and lifted it up fiercely. "Do you have the guts to curse again?" Icarus's mouth was full of blood. When he opened his mouth, one of his front teeth fell out. I thought. I couldn't help but sigh, "He's so pitiful." Then I silently took my hand out of the school bag. It seemed that the brick wouldn't be needed. Icarus had always been satisfied with his looks. Now that he saw his tooth fall out, he went crazy instantly. He rolled over and got up from the ground, and threw a punch at Hercules. Hercules easily blocked it and then kicked him in the stomach. Icarus bent over in pain. When he raised his head, his gaze was fierce. But when he clearly saw Hercules's face, he froze directly. Then his pupils dilated, and he couldn't help but shiver. "It's you?" Hercules was also taken aback when he saw Icarus's reaction. "Do you know me?" After coming to his senses, Icarus shook his head frantically. Then he picked up the school bag on the ground and turned around to run. Hercules was quick-eyed and quick-handed. He grabbed Icarus's collar. Before he could say anything, Icarus's face turned deathly pale from fear, and he shouted loudly with trembling legs, "I won't dare anymore. I promise I'll never come looking for Phoenix again." He even peed his pants out of fear. Hercules frowned and let go of his hand, then took my hand and left the alley. I asked Hercules how he knew I was here. He carried my school bag on his back and said proudly, "There are only 2 high schools in the county, and this one is closer to our village." I couldn't help but laugh and praised him generously. "Yeah, you're so smart." Hercules blushed. "Are you coaxing me like a child?" Although my body is only 18 years old now, my mental age is nearly 10 years older than his. In my eyes, he really is like a child. I always feel like an old cow eating young grass. Thinking of this, I asked Hercules, "Did my parents give you a hard time?" Hercules quickly replied, "No, not at all. I didn't believe a single word, not even the punctuation marks. Based on what I know about my parents, they might not have cursed him, but they definitely didn't give him a good face." I didn't say anything and just stared at him quietly. Hercules gritted his teeth and looked at me for a long time. Finally, he gave in and said dejectedly, "They really didn't give me a hard time. But they just raised the wall." "What?" Hercules nodded. "They raised it by a full meter. At first, I thought they wanted to renovate the wall. So I even went to help. And then?" Hercules looked up and looked at me with a wronged expression. "Then, what out a lo-fi? After the wall was built, they put a dozen or so mousetraps by the wall right in front of me. Theft." I imagined that scene and couldn't help it. When we got off the shuttle bus at the entrance of the village, Hercules handed me the school bag. "You go first. Don't let Uncle see you." "Wait a minute." On the way, I saw him sneakily stuffing something into his bag. As expected, I felt a cloth bag in it. "Take this." "I don't want it." Hercules' face turned red immediately, and he quickly denied it. "This isn't mine." I tilted my head and looked at him. "Are you sure? Then I'll throw it away." Hercules couldn't pretend anymore and had to admit it. "Why don't you want it? If I don't give my money to you, then to whom should I give it?" My heart ached when I heard that. He was really as silly as I was in my past life, although I'm sure I won't change. "I definitely can't take this money." I told him to keep it for himself, and that it wouldn't be too late to give it to me after we got married in the future. Hercules was smart and instantly understood what I meant. He pursed his lips. "Even if you don't marry me in the future, I still want to give this to you. I'm happy to spend money on you." I looked up at him with a smile. "I know you're worried that my family can't afford to support my studies. Don't worry. My dad will get a promotion and a raise after the spring festival. In my past life, my dad was promoted to deputy factory director, and his salary doubled directly. My family wasn't short of money, so I gave all the money I earned from working to Icarus. I understand your feelings, but I'd rather you use this money to do what you want to do. Aren't you interested in doing business? Then use it as the startup capital. It won't be too late to give it to me after you've made a lot of money." Hercules didn't say anything and just refused to take the money back. At this moment, I suddenly saw a person turning out from the entrance of the village. When I saw that familiar figure, my eyelids twitched. I quickly stuffed the bag into Hercules' arms. "Quick, like us. My dad is coming." Even though I was mentally prepared, I was still startled when I saw the mousetraps at the base of the wall. Hercules was actually being modest. It wasn't just a dozen or so. At a rough estimate, there were at least 20 or 30. There was really no need to be so harsh. "Right?" My dad glanced at me. "How about it? Pretty good. Right? If anyone dares to climb over the wall again, it will definitely give them an unforgettable experience." I thought. Why does it feel like he's saying this to me? During the spring festival days, my mom kept a close eye on me, afraid that I would meet Hercules. It wasn't until after the school started after the spring festival that I saw him on the shuttle bus to the county. He was sitting in the last row. When he saw me, he silently curved his lips. Hercules carried a big bag with him. As soon as I sat down, he first took out a scarf and gloves from the bag and put them on me. And he took out a thermos flask and stuffed it into my hand. At this time, the thermos flask was still the kind converted from a drip bottle, with a glass body, and it felt really hot to the touch. It takes an hour to get from home to the county by bus. Hercules wasn't idle during the whole journey. He took out a bag of sunflower seeds from the bag and slowly peeled them. Then he put the peeled sunflower seeds into my hand. He was unhurried when doing this. And he looked especially gentle. I couldn't help but be drawn to him. Perhaps because he had been working away from home since he was a child. He had a kind of steadiness that was beyond that of his peers. With him by my side when going out, I felt especially at ease. He was indeed better looking than Icarus. But because he had been running around outside all year round, he was a bit rough. Sensing my gaze, Hercules' face became redder and redder. In the end, he simply reached out his hand and covered my eyes. His hand was very cold, and it made me shiver. Hercules realized and wanted to take his hand back, but I grabbed it. Hercules looked around and said softly, "Let go quickly. My hand is cold." I didn't say anything and placed his hand on the thermos flask. Hercules was stiff all over and let me hold his hand without moving. But the smile on his lips grew bigger and bigger. Since there was only one shuttle bus going to and from the county every day, Hercules hurried back after sending me near the school. After watching him leave, when I turned around, Icarus was actually standing behind me. He looked at me with a cold gaze, his teeth chattering. "You really came with him? Tell me. Have you two been having an affair for a long time?" I gave him a cold glance. "It's none of your business. Are you being a jerk again?" Icarus's chest heaved violently a few times. But miraculously, he calmed down. Looking at me, he said in an affirmative tone, "You're reborn too. Right?" I suddenly raised my head. Too? He was actually reborn too. For so long, I had never even thought of this possibility. After all, he died at my hands in his past life. If he was reborn, how dare he come looking for me again? Why wouldn't I dare? Icarus laughed triumphantly. "You must never have expected that I didn't die that time. I only got a minor injury. That cliff was dozens of meters high. And he actually didn't die. It's really true that the wicked live a long life." I suddenly thought that since he didn't die, how did he get reborn? Icarus gritted his teeth and said, "It was Hercules. He killed me." Icarus said that after he recovered from his injury, he married that female schoolmate. After marriage, his wife didn't treat him as a human being. She humiliated him several times, saying that he was a gigolo and that he was good for nothing. Later, for the sake of a piece of land, she knocked him out and gave him to Hercules. When Icarus said this, his eyes were scarlet with excitement. "None of those women are any good. Only you, only you. Only you were the best to me." I forcefully suppressed the churning emotions in my heart and asked the question I cared about the most. What about Hercules? What happened to him in the end? "He killed me and threw me off the cliff. And then he committed suicide." He seemed to have heard a really funny joke, and tears came out of his eyes from laughing. The first time I saw him, I thought he had been reborn too. But he didn't recognize me at all, so I knew he hadn't been reborn. I'm the only one who knows the development direction in the next few decades. As long as you treat me like you did in the last life, I promise I'll make you live a good life. So it turned out that in his last life, when he reached the end, he found that I was the easiest to deceive. And now in this life, he wants to deceive me again. He really takes me for a fool. I asked him, "Do you know why your wife treated you like that?" Icarus was taken aback for a moment. I sneered and said, "Because you don't deserve to be loved at all. You were betrayed and abandoned in the end. And you deserve it. A person like you. No matter how many times you're reborn, no one will love you." Icarus seemed to have been struck by lightning. He mumbled to himself, "It's impossible. You're talking nonsense. Someone loves me. There is someone who loves me. You love me. Yes. You have to love me." He was like a madman, rushing towards me to grab me. Unexpectedly, Hercules came back. He directly punched Icarus in the face. Icarus seemed not to feel the pain. He immediately got up and tried to pull me, saying, "Phoenix is mine. No, no one can take her away from me. Phoenix is mine. Only Phoenix is truly sincere to me." Hercules protected me behind him and grabbed Icarus' neck with one hand to keep him from getting close to me. Icarus couldn't break free. In a flash, he showed a malicious smile and said, "Do you know that Phoenix was completely used up by me in the last life? Only you still cherish her so much. The person you love most in your life is just what I left behind." My heart tightened, and I instinctively tried to pull my hand back. Hercules held my hand tightly and wouldn't let go. Then he took a step back and kicked Icarus again with a thud. He used all his strength in this kick. Icarus was kicked more than a meter away and fell to the ground with a splat, and he fainted directly. After this incident, Icarus was expelled from school because the hospital diagnosed him with mental illness. And it was already very serious. Hercules and I went to visit him in the mental hospital once. He was wearing a hospital gown and crawling on the ground to catch ants, getting himself all dirty. He didn't recognize anyone. On the bench in the hospital, Hercules and I sat side by side. Actually, what Icarus said was true. In the last life, I was with him for 10 years. I lived until I was 28 years old. And after I died, I came back to the present. I turned to look at him and asked, "Do you have anything you want to ask?" In fact, he should have guessed it from Icarus' words last time. But I never brought it up, and he never asked either. Now that this matter has come to a certain stage, it's time to tell him. I was prepared to answer all kinds of his questions. But as soon as I finished speaking, his pupils suddenly shrank, and he tightly grasped my hand. "Why was it when you were 28 years old? How could you?" He seemed not even daring to say that word. He just held my hand tighter and tighter. After a long while, he squeezed out a sentence through his teeth. "Did he bully you?" I looked at the person lying on the ground and slowly told Hercules all the entanglements from the previous life in detail. When he heard that I drove the car with Icarus off the cliff, but only I died, his chest heaved violently. And he asked me, "Then, what about me? Where was I? Did I just watch him bully you?" I gently squeezed his fingers and smiled. "Guess, having fulfilled my sigh. How did he get reborn?" Hercules immediately reacted. "Was it because of me?" When he learned that he finally avenged me in the end, Hercules' breathing finally calmed down a bit. He stared at Icarus intently for a long time. Finally, having fulfilled my sigh, when no one was paying attention, he went up and kicked over the basin that Icarus used to hold the ants. Then, amidst Icarus wailing, he led me and ran out of the hospital. Because of what happened to Icarus. Although my parents still wouldn't agree verbally, they no longer objected to Hercules sending me to school. After the college entrance examination, I was admitted to my ideal university as I wished. My parents also agreed to my marriage with Hercules. When I was in college, Hercules used the money he had saved over the years to open a small store near my school. By the time I graduated, his small store had developed into a department store. It actually developed even better than in the last life. I praised him for his talent in business. He hugged me proudly and said, "Of course. I must give my wife the best life." The end.